Okay, so the recording has started. This is Joy from the Department of Libraries, and we've got Laura and April and Tom from the Department of Libraries here as well. And then we have Gary Deziel here, who's from the UVM Extension Program. He's done a lot of work with us already about library budgets and finances, and he's also trained in HR issues. So he has a presentation for us today to help with some of the challenges that we're all going through right now with library closures and how to handle that and how to handle it financially. So thank you so much, Gary, and welcome to everybody who's here. You can keep your mics off, but if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat and we'll keep an eye on them and pass your thoughts along to Gary. So take it away, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about budget management in this very strange time. And by way of introduction, I do work for the University of Vermont Extension, which is part of UVM, and we have offices in 11 places across the state. They're all closed, of course, now, just like your library, but we're working from our homes. Prior to this position, which I started early last year, I was Associate Dean of Budget, Finance, and Operations, responsible for our budget, for HR. And I also am the treasurer of the Georgia Public Library, which is a municipal library. So I just wanted to start with that little introduction. Really appreciate you joining me today. And I wanted also to say a shout out to Laura, to Joy, to Jeanette, to all the folks at the Vermont Department of Libraries who are doing an amazing job keeping everybody together, sharing ideas. I just have a little screenshot here of the Vermont Department of Libraries COVID-19 website. So it's been wonderful working with the Vermont Department of Libraries, as well as I've worked a little with the Vermont Library Association as well. So thanks a lot to you guys. What's on the docket today? I don't mean on speaking a long time, and hopefully we'll have some discussion. So I'm going to start with quick, not budget suggestions, and just very briefly some of the things to think about right now that might help your budgeting as we emerge from this pandemic and as we go forward in the future. Then I have a small collection of budget management tips. I've got some examples of payment cycles, and I have a little bit about whether or not budgets can be changed or should be changed. And if there's any interest, I have some quick words about endowments. And then we can end with discussions and questions and answers. And if there are any questions, just put them in the chat box and I can rely on Joy to interrupt me. So you've heard these things before from the Vermont Department of Libraries, from communications, from the folks on this conference call. Transparency is really important right now in communications and just how things are going and how you're doing things. Also, a high recommendation from the HR folks is that high contact now, especially with people you supervise and people that you work with closely, is really important. We are certainly isolated and have a greater feeling of isolation right now than ever before. And daily contact with supervisors is suggested. Reward and recognition is very important right now. And it's so wonderful. I saw yesterday that our library director, Bridget, in Georgia Public Library, sent out this little message about how she's contacting people. And it was just so heartwarming to see all the responses. And, she got her Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame kind of thing. And in fact, she was contacted by, I believe, the Maine Department of Libraries, as well as Senator Leahy's office. So, that feedback that you can give others and others can give you is really important right now. It's also this huge time of creativity. I just got a text from somebody just over lunchtime saying that their brain hurts. The last 3 weeks has been so full of learning opportunity that that it's just been really quite a challenge. So I wanted to send kudos to you on what you folks are doing. It's amazing because the library is not just a library. It's a community center. It's a place where the town gets together. It's a place of information. It's for workforce development. It's all sorts of things. And how the creativity that I've seen is amazing. And I love that creativity database that Vermont Libraries has put together. To go on, I see a lot of value to town and community, which is really important right now, and continuing to communicate with funders, with people who are important to your resources is really important right now. Strengthening and maintaining relationships will come in handy as we go towards the end of May. I see Governor Scott has asked us by declaration of an emergency through May 15th to stay at home and working. So as we get into June and July, the bridges that we build and the bridges that we mend will be vitally important, especially as we head into the next fiscal year. I did want to also note that if you have grants or contracts, sponsored agreements, it is also important right now to communicate with those funders to make sure you're doing what needs to be done, that there's no question about what's going on, and that'll help, again, that communication will help you meet their needs and continue to receive that grant funding. It's a really important time to take out that strategic planning document because it's really important to connect your mission to the actions that you're doing now. And how's that related to budget? Well, budget is a demonstration of how your mission is put into action. What we all spend on personally, for instance, the money that we give to organizations as gifts and contributions, for instance, shows what our mission is and what our values are. So that's really important to do that. And now the tactical planning now in preparation for 2021 is important, I think. Thinking about the impact on pandemic on your gifts, the endowment revenue. There's huge unknowns. For instance, the town of Georgia has one of the lowest property tax non-payment levels around. But what happens if it goes up to 10% or 8%? What will that do to our budget? There's a lot of unknowns. So just going back to communicating, building bridges, mending bridges, and just making sure that people who are in the town or board of trustees, funders, they know and are clear about the value that we're adding right now to our community. Just going to pause right there. See if there's, Joy, you just tell me if there's any comments. Of course, if there's any comments or questions on the last few slides, we'll let Joy or Laura answer them. So the budget, the show must go on. I had to, of course, use a cliche, and I like this picture because there's this trapeze artist. There's a woman dangling by her teeth. There's the couple flying through the air, hoping, praying that somebody's going to catch them. And I think a lot of us feel like this right now, in being vulnerable to what's going on. But I think that you've shown in your programming how creative you are. On the budget side, we just have to keep things going. So here's a few budget management points that I think are important to keep in mind. First, budgeting time. So what we want to do is we want to keep current. We don't want invoices and bills to fall off the edge of the desk in between the wall and the radiator and get lost, because that's going to put you in a bad position in trying to keep up. So just try to keep up. Also, if you budget time, that is something, that's a task that you can keep track of. It's something that you need to do, something that trustees need to do. So it's important to do. I was thinking about keeping it current just at lunchtime because we had an invoice from our photocopier equipment company, and by God, they give you 2 solid weeks to pay the bill before it's past due. So I had a second bill that I had to prepare a purchase order for, and so the bill was double what it should be. So I had to write a note to the town bookkeeper saying, ignore this amount. So if I had kept current, it would have saved me a little bit of time in fixing things. Another thing is that code the expense correctly, and we want in a budget when you're doing budget management, when you're doing reporting on a regular basis, you want to know exactly what you spent. You don't want to buy something and then code it wrong because you won't really understand how your money is flowing out your door. I think there's a tendency for some folks to see like, oh, in my electronic ebooks budget line, I only have X number of dollars. I need to spend more money right now. But I've got money in books, in children's books. So why don't I just code it to that so it doesn't look like I'm over in electronic books. But what you want to do is you want to code it correctly so that you see how much you're over. And then people will understand this is a pandemic year. They'll remember this like 1918. And they'll understand that you have odd expenses or the lines don't quite match up. And you'll be able to explain that just by keeping track of your invoices and keeping track of your records. If you haven't, a business process where you have clarified how bills are paid, how payroll is paid, written down, I suggest write it down. It's just for a point of clarification. It helps people understand what they're responsible for. Between the treasurer and the library director. If the town is involved, you have a bookkeeper, a treasurer. You just want to make sure that people know what the sequence of events are when you're paying an invoice, paying a bill, or doing payroll. And then something that came out of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns was based on the CARES Act, that $2 trillion emergency package. There may be money in there for state governments trickling down to local governments. We would probably be a good idea to code or collect together in a folder things that were specifically in response to COVID-19. They could be sanitizers or cleaners for your offices in those first weeks or two where we were crazily cleaning everything, or they could be things that you added on to a new router for your Wi-Fi internet system to reach people in the parking lot, for instance. Code it, put it in a separate folder, and this may be reimbursed down the line. At UVM, we have been given a new code for these kinds of expenses because the university is also expecting some sort of help in covering these crazy unplanned expenses related to the pandemic. Don't worry, I've only got 78 slides, so there's only 70 left to go. I'm just kidding, there's 10 left to go. Can we change the current year budget? I hear that question quite often, and I managed budgets for a long time, and the answer is no, or generally no. If you, for instance, are in a municipal library, the answer is no, because the budget was passed. Thank God this is after town meeting. The budget was passed at town meeting. It was, this is what you have authority to spend, and that's the way it stays. If you're in an incorporated library, you are, of course, a nonprofit corporation. So the Board of Trustees may do as they see fit. But it's generally not accepted practice or recommended practice to change your budget. You can shift your expenses, but don't change your budget is my recommendation. This will be an anomaly year, I hope, and differences over spending in certain categories is likely to be expected, and underspending in other categories may be expected as well. So just keep to your budget, and then when you're doing next year's budget, you can look back at this, see the differences between this year, 2019, 2018, and you might be able to get you'll see that there's a blip, but don't change your budget is my recommendation. To be careful, we in Georgia, we of course try to keep payroll really, really close to our budget, because of course people have hours they expect to be paid, so we have to respect the employees. But this is something that we'd like to hit really pretty closely, and the operating expenses are of course where it's more discretionary. I have just a couple of examples. This first example is managing a bill, and I understand there's a lot of differences between libraries, incorporated or municipal. And if you think of your own personal experience of how you manage purchases, what you do is you make a purchase decision, right? You say you need something. Just my mind is blank, which is not unusual. But you make a purchase decision, you go to the internet or you're going to the store, you look for a quote. What you do is you find something on the shelf that you like and you buy it. You pay for it, you get the receipt, you go back home. You might reconcile your checkbook, I hope you do, to keep it on track. But that is the same thing can happen at an incorporated library, or a municipal library can get a little bit more complicated. Purchase decision, you have a quote, you need the approval to make the purchase through a purchase order. The purchase order is submitted, it's approved by the bookkeeper, approved by the library treasurer, it's paid for, you get the receipt, and then the bookkeeper reconciles. So this is something that's pretty common. Now we're like scattered to the four winds, so we've had to think of something else. So in a socially distanced world, we're thinking of virtual systems to replace the paper process. I think, truth be told, a lot of us are working already pretty much into the virtual world. I know that there are, I think there's at least one library on the call that, for instance, uses a third-party payroll manager, perhaps out of Randolph, and then a bookkeeper that is in a totally different city or town. So a lot of things are done virtually already. But you have to try to turn invoices or bills, paper bills, somehow into electronic things. And what we've done in Georgia is we've just converted to PDF files. We do actually have an employee who is checking the mail, and they will scan the paper bills. And our library director has contacted vendors to see if she could get invoices that were electronic exclusively. So turn bills into PDF files. You need approval, of course, to pay for something. You know, somebody needs to approve it. So it's usually the library director, and that can be just a written thing saying I approve it. With written approvals, Adobe Pro, if you have access to that kind of software, you can put in electronic signatures, and of course smartphones give you a lot of options. Adobe Scan is a really handy tool to use. It has very good quality, and so all these tools can be used to replace, and I'll go backwards here, these steps. So for instance, the quote or the invoice, turned into a PDF purchase order rather than a paper purchase order. We have it now in an it's an Excel format, so we just fill it out, change it to a PDF, stick the invoice with a purchase order, send it to the bookkeeper, and have it paid. I should probably pause right now. I'm going to shift to payroll a little bit, but I've said a lot. So why don't I give opportunity for anyone who wants to say or ask anything.
So I've actually muted everybody, so if you can type it, or you could ask me to unmute you, or I could take a minute here and go through and unmute everyone.
No, don't do that, Joy.
Okay.
Why don't we stick with the chat box? Because we now have about 30 participants. So
my only hesitation with that is that some people are calling in. So
oh, right, and they can't raise their hand either.
I'm going to unmute the people who just have.
Okay. Well, I'll wait a few more seconds.
So Gary, while she's doing that, there's a question that's in the box from Cindy. She says, we have 3 very part-time employees who no longer have work due to the stay-at-home order. I believe I have to lay them off. We are a municipal library. Any thoughts, responses to that?
Boy, that, the unemployment law is really right now quite complicated. The Vermont Department of Labor is having 2 town hall meetings every week as they learn about what's going on. That said, I would of course default first to your personnel policy. If the personnel policy is part of the town, make sure that you are in line with the town recommendations. Laura, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but it is at an at-will state. Therefore, you can change employment status of an employee, and an employee can quit their employer at will. You have to nuance that with personnel policies. What's usually done, and if you're in a union situation, that is totally different too. It's the conditions of work are defined by the contract. But Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, Cindy looks like she talked to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. They said that they couldn't pay employees who don't work, and there's no union. So I think there are a lot of factors to weigh. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. If your town says, you've got employees that are not working, then you need to lay them off, then you'll want to talk to the town officials about that and just make sure everyone's on the same page, knowing that depending on how these people have been paid in the past, there is a potential that they might be eligible for unemployment. And if they are, then the town will be charged that. So that will be an expense for the town if folks go on unemployment. But then again, they might be able to get more on unemployment than they were getting working anyway. So it's because of the federal bill that was just passed. So there's a lot of factors to weigh. I think it's definitely worth, especially Cindy and anyone else who works for a municipal library, depending on your personnel policy, really talk with folks in the administration of your town to really figure out what's going to work best for the town and for your employees, and to make sure your trustees are in on the loop of this as well. And if there really is nothing these folks can do, if they can't participate in any of the phone calls to patrons like Bridget was doing that she put on the listserv, or if they can't participate in gathering materials to mail to folks, or any other sort of creative ways you can think to engage the patrons who may not be on the internet, or even for patrons who are on the internet, if you can't think of any things that employees can do during this time, then yeah, I think it's time to start having those tough conversations. Kathleen typed to Gary, she's trying to apply for a payroll protection plan as a nonprofit. Do you have any advice where folks can go to learn more about that, or anything you know about that?
Boy, I do not. I've read a little bit about it and how the program is being slammed right now. I guess I would go back to the Vermont League of Cities. Now, I can try to find some information, but I don't know anything. I really don't know anything about that.
This is Joy. I wonder if the Arts Council might have something on that. They have been doing some things with people in the arts and arts organizations. I'm not sure, but you could check their website. They might have some information on there about that.
Right, and there is a nonprofit organization too, U.S. that I think might have some information there too, but I'm not sure. When we get into unemployment law, boy, and with the CARES Act and Families First Act, boy, you have to go to the people that are like spending 60 hours a week in that right now.
So Gary, this is Joy again. Before we go on, I'm not able to unmute the people who are calling in by phone. I can unmute the people who are watching us. So just if you're on the phone and you have a question, probably best if you just text me and I will pass it on. And that number is, oh wow, what is my number? Oh my gosh, 798-2567. It's my work number that I hardly ever use. So sorry for that workaround, but I will get your information to Gary.
Thanks, Joy. So I'll continue. Here's an example of a virtual bill paying, and again, it's just a reiteration of what I tried to describe just a few minutes ago. A director receives the invoice, saves it as a PDF or converts it. As I said, at Georgia Public Library, we do have an employee who's checking mail, actual U.S. postage service mail. Then the director approves it by sending the trustee treasurer the invoice as a PDF in email. Trustee treasurer fills out the purchase order using the correct account codes most often, no, all the time, and then puts it together with the invoice and sends it to the bookkeeper. So this, of course, would differ tremendously on what kind of process you have, but keeping it going is really the big point. Write down what you do, keep it going, and just make sure that bills are paid. With regard to payroll, meeting payroll, of course, is a legal responsibility. The employee puts in the hours, the employee submits time. When the employee submits time, they are legally saying that they work those hours. When the supervisor approves that time, the supervisor is certifying legally that that employee did work those hours. So we got this two-way street going. Employee is saying that she works those hours. Supervisor is saying, yes, my employee did work those hours. And that's really important in an audit, for instance, is that, auditors are always looking for what auditors look for, which is fraud, and making sure all the cookies are counted. So this is important. And then in our case, I didn't mention warrants before. I don't think people in other towns work with warrants. A warrant is a document that I sign as the library treasurer to confirm, like the third confirmation that this is a true expense. So the supervisor approves time is submitted. I certify upon the certification, and then it is paid by the town of Georgia. All this is has been electronic anyway, and I think probably, well, maybe you don't have payroll that's electronic, but you'd have to switch somehow using PDFs, using a smartphone, using some sort of process. And again, make sure it's codified, make sure the people who are responsible for their different parts know what their role is. I just wanted to say a few words about endowments, and maybe I'll bleed into gifts a little bit, friends of the library kind of things. And basically, I think that you probably understand this, but the difference between a gift and an endowment is that a gift is meant to be used right away. if you go to a birthday party and someone hands you a nicely wrapped package, it's a gift. They don't want you to put it in there, you to put it in your closet for 5 years and open it then. They want to see they want immediate results with a big smile on your face when you open that package. So gifts are meant to be used pretty much immediately. In fact, at UVM, if we didn't use a gift fund to the extent that UVM Foundation thought we would get a note from the UVM controller reminding us that we should spend the money. Otherwise, we'd have to give them a report about what we were doing with that money. An endowment is money that's given to you that is meant to always be there for you, always give you some sort of revenue, hopefully growing into the future so that it keeps up or exceeds inflation. So an endowment is a long-term gift. There's a library in the area that has it was a very humble gift, but it was about 100 years ago, and it's grown tremendously. And she would have a smile on her face. She was a nurse that gave money to this library, and it's grown to be a significant pot of cash. So if you have an endowment or trust, if you have the investment and spending policy, make sure you review it and make sure you follow it. And if you have any questions, the important thing is to seek professional advice regarding any changes. Most endowments, I should go to the next slide. Here it is, endowments in the pandemic. So you can, if you know that the equity markets, as represented by Dow, have declined quite a bit. In the first quarter of 2020, which just ended in March, the Dow was down about 18%, a little over 18%. But endowment investment strategy is built around protecting that principle and growing that principle. And the ways it is done is there's a few ways. You're balancing investments in equities, which are stocks, and fixed income, cash, CDs, and other things. And it's balanced in a way so that endowments are generally not invested very aggressively. An example I can use is if you're saving for retirement when you're 20 years old, is much different than saving retirement when you're 61 years old. So when you're 20, you want to be very aggressive with that money. Yeah, plenty of stocks, plenty of real estates, whatever. And when you're 60, you want it to be pretty conservative because you don't want to lose very much money in a down market. Of course, you won't gain very much money in an up market. But that balance between stocks and fixed income is really important. And investment policies will generally, they'll say 60-40 with ranges, depending on how the Board of Trustees feels with the advice of their financial guide on how to invest that. So in many ways, it's protected by how it's invested. The other thing that's really, really important in endowments is that it gives you income averaged over time. So usually an endowment looks back 3 to 4 years and takes an average balance of each quarter. And then based on that average, you take a certain percent, usually 3 to 5%. So it's sort of like this. One of my coworkers has 11 siblings. Well, actually, she has 10, but I'm rounding up to a dozen. And say every one of them is 6 feet tall, but she's anomaly. She's 5'4". It's sort of like this is a down market here in height. If you take the average across those 12, the average is 5'11" and 1/3 inches. So you can see in a down market, your endowment results will be dampened or buffered by the value averaging across time. And also taking out a small percentage every year will be to your benefit. My Fidelity investment person tells me if I retire and only take 4% of my retirement out, which I couldn't possibly live on, by the way, he says that when I die, I'll have more money than when I started. And I thought, that's dumb. My 20-something-year-old daughter doesn't think it's dumb. But that's another important part of endowments. So it's the asset mix, it's the value averaging over time, and it's taking a little bit out at a time that will grow your principal and give you a reliable revenue. So I think that is about it, Joy.
Okay, so if people have questions, then now is a great time for them. Kathleen, I wanted to make sure, did you see that thing I put in the chat box about nonprofits? Kathleen Engstrom. I was trying to send it just to you, and then I was multitasking, so it's to everybody here. But I just want to make sure you saw it, if you're still here, Kathleen. Oh, you can't talk, can you? Okay.
Let's not ask Kathleen any more questions.
No, she's talking with her. She's writing. Okay. Does anyone else have questions for Gary, or comments, or issues that you're having around these kind of topics at your libraries right now that haven't already been talked about? Any other Department of Library people that are on the call want to add anything in?
I should say, oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted somebody perhaps.
Hi, this is Tom. I just wanted to say thanks. This was really interesting.
Well, thank you, Tom. And I just wanted to add that anybody can send me an email at any time too. So, I mean, if you have and that's the way sometimes budgeting is, that's the way your relationships with the trustees are, or with the town, or with your investments. Every gift is different. Everything seems to be different. So you can always just email me with a question, and I'd be glad to respond, glad to help in any way I can.
So Gary, there is another question in the chat. How do you see fundraising changing in events that used to be upfront and personal?
Fundraising, that's a good question. Here in Georgia, we've really been kind of struggling with getting friends involved. Recently, we've been much more successful. I'm very excited about what's happening. Boy, it's so different now, isn't it? I don't know what to say. Laura and Joy, you might have something to say. I'm hoping, and I was at a webinar yesterday with the Society for Human Resource Management, and it was with Dr. Jay Cutler, who's I can't remember his title. He's Associate Director of the CDC. And he was sort of outlining what he might expect if the social distancing works in flattening the curve, if there's an antidote developed sooner than later. We know that a vaccine won't be developed for some time just because of how long it takes to protect human health. But he saw it as sort of a stepwise kind of reintroduction to work. That is, healthier folks, younger folks. We know that if you're over 65, you have there's more challenges with this pandemic. But I just pray that we'll be back to some level of normalcy within 2 to 3 months, where we'll be not so isolated again. And I think there is huge opportunity right now. There are people that have jobs. There are people that have money that are looking for giving. And maybe this is the best opportunity that we have to raise money, especially based on the value that we're creating. And I think it's an opportunity for some. I think there was an editorial on USA Today last week that said it's time for tithing to everybody. You know, there are people that don't have emergency funds. There's people that don't have backup here. But there's also people that are willing to give, and it might be a fantastic opportunity. Joy.
This is Laura. I've been attending a couple webinars recently where people have been talking about how to transform the old way of doing things with fundraising to a new paradigm of how to do them if people don't gather again for a while. And a couple ideas that came up that I guess I can share for folks, because I've been talking to a lot of other folks about it, is how can you turn your event-based fundraising into non-event fundraising? So to be creative around how you can help people stay home and help the library celebrate their event in a way where they celebrate it in their home. So one of the ways that this happens a lot, it's fairly common, are these things called stay home and read-a-thons. If you look at the virtual programming for adults page on the Vermont Department of Libraries website, you'll see 4 different links to examples of the stay home and read-a-thons, one of which was done by the Manchester Community Library here in Vermont, where basically you give a theme to your read-a-thon and then you come up with a creative, whimsical way for people to participate in their homes. For instance, the example I've been giving a lot is this, the places you won't go type of readathon based on the Dr. Seuss theme. And you have people sort of check off where they won't be going because they'll be staying at home to read. And then the location they check off has a donation price attached to it, and people send that money into the library. So that's one example. Or you can think of other ways, like if you're going to have a gala or some sort of author reading, how can you encourage people to dole themselves up at home and have a little bit of fun in their houses, have little parties that they do in their house, and then join you visually on some sort of visual platform, or even just send the library pictures and then donate to the library the amount of money they would have spent at the gala instead. Those are just some ideas to hopefully inspire you to think creatively about how you might be able to change up your normal fundraisers, that normal event-based fundraisers or person-based fundraisers to keep them going moving forward.
So we still have a little bit more time if people have other questions, but I just want to point out that there is a link to an evaluation for this, both on Gary's slide, and I just put it in the chat as well. And then while I was talking, another question came in, a link to the readathon. It's on our website, but we could probably grab it right now as well.
And also just to follow up on Joy's comment about the link to the evaluation, that's really important to us. So thank you very much for taking time to do that.
It's very short. If you've been to our other webinars, you'll recognize it. But it is very helpful.
So for those, this is Laura. For those of you who can see the conversation happening on the side, the chat box, I just put in the link to the virtual programming for adults page on our website, and on that, if you scroll down, you'll see the readathons links.
And again, for the people on the phone, that is on the Vermont Department of Libraries website under our COVID-19 resources. There's a whole page devoted to virtual adult programming, as well as lots of other resources on there if you haven't taken a look there yet. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Gary. This has been so helpful. We will put a recording of this up and grab the links from the chat and send that out, as well as Gary's slides. So if you didn't get everything he was saying in the last 45 minutes, that's okay. And again, like Laura said, we're always happy to hear from you, ask questions, get in touch anytime. Anyone at the Department of Libraries can try to be helpful to you in any way. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Gary.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.